My name is John, and I've been the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania now for 10 years. I took office in 2006, and it's really been a great journey. And it's the best place I've ever given a presentation, I would say, is right here, because the struggles that we face in our community line up almost perfectly with the struggles that have ended a lot of other people, up here at this place. So it's a great honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to try to work out a rhythm with the poor guy that has to keep up with me backstage clicking these slides. And I want to thank the accommodation of having PowerPoint. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay. Braddock got its name from a British general, Edward Braddock, who with about 600 British troops thought he was going to go down into the valley and kick a lot of French and Indian tail, and he ended up getting massacred. He and 600 of his troops were all mortally wounded there, and that's where we got our name. So we weren't off to a great start at that point. It also happens to be George Washington's first combat experience. So this was, Braddock was instrumental in the early formation of our country. Next slide. Why else is Braddock famous? Well, it's the birthplace of Andrew Carnegie's first steel mill. And Andrew Carnegie, of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, the richest man that's ever lived, and his legacy is still shaping not only the Pittsburgh region, but essentially the world through a lot of the philanthropic things that he left behind. But remember, it all started in my community, and it is something that has transformed the world, and it was the Silicon Valley of its day. Next slide, please. And if you can see that image, and I hope you can, that's what my community looked like in 1955. It was an incredibly prosperous, incredibly vibrant. You never had a reason to leave Braddock. It was ridiculously dense with all kinds of consumer options and commerce and employment. Next slide, please. Again, next slide. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. Again, just department stores, women can go buy a suit for $14.88. So that gives you an idea of how long ago this was. Next slide, please. So 1955, we had 30 tailors, 25 show stores, 14 jewelers, 51 barbershops, 3 newspapers, and 53 restaurants. They're really, as you can see, and this is not a big community. It's about 3/4 of a square mile. So it was as densely packed as modern-day Brooklyn, New York is. Next slide, please. And then over the course of the subsequent decades, look what happened to Braddock. It went from a community of 20,000 residents to a community of 2,500 residents. And this is what our Braddock Avenue looked like in 2005. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This building, I might add, isn't being torn down. It actually fell apart after a thunderstorm because the conditions were that severe. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So then you fast forward to 2005, and you look at those same business categories, and they've all dropped down to zero, essentially. We have one place where you can go get your hair cut and your hair styled, but of course, no restaurants, no banks, no movie theaters, no grocery stores. Of course, went from 13 or 14 furniture stores down to zero. Next, please. And of course, in a community that's lost 90% of everything that defines it, what it was, you're going to have an intense pocket of poverty, and that's exactly what Braddock is. Braddock is, socioeconomically speaking, the poorest community in Allegheny County, of which we are all in today. And if you look at the median household income, it's dramatically lower than not only Pennsylvania's average, but also the United States. And the median home price, at least back then, you could buy a home that you could move into with a little elbow grease for under $5,000, where And it's remarkable when I tell audiences that in Chicago or in New York City, it's like, that's a gym membership. Next, please. And of course, if you look at the headline samplings from 2005, you just go to the Post-Gazette and do a search for Braddock. This is what comes up: murder, stabbing. It wasn't a place that anybody, I was warned when I was going to start work there. It's like, you really don't want to do that. Watch out, be careful, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't a single positive headline that I could really find during those early days. Next, please. And this is an example of what happens, as Vanessa pointed out, when you hear those 14 gunshots. This is a tribute wall from one of the many gunshot victims in Braddock from 2003. Next, please. So that's what happened when I was elected in 2005 and took office. It's like, what can you do, or what should you do? Is there anything that you can do in a community that has lost 90% of everything that made it a community? And these next slides are going to demonstrate very quickly some of the things that we did. We have an abandoned church in the community, one of the last ones standing. Next slide, please. And we turned it into a brand new community center for our young people, named after a little girl who was a victim of unspeakable violence in the early part of my administration. Next slide. We created the largest summer youth program in Allegheny County. Each summer now we handle roughly 100 young people and provide them with summer jobs and constructive activities that are legacy projects, whether it's working on the farm, whether it's working in the arts, whether it's video production. And from my perspective as the mayor and the head of the police department, there's nothing beats a young person who's tired at the end of the day with money in his pocket. So we have, representative of the housing stock in Braddock, 2 abandoned houses. And we, of course, fixed those up to create housing for young people that have exited the foster care system and would have otherwise been homeless. Next slide, please. This was our largest lot on Braddock Avenue, and it looks like an urban forest. And you can kind of see how the vestigial architecture in the background belies the current condition of the community. So you have this, this wild landscape. And I also want to point out, in 2006, my community did not have a functional playground in it. So we took this lot, next slide please, and created a 4,000 square foot playground. Next slide please. For a place for Braddock's children to come and play. Something that I took for granted in the community that I grew up in. Next, please. You have, again, one of Braddock's many hotels. Next, please. And we turned that into a 2-acre urban farm in the shadow of a steel mill. That provides, next slide, please, urban produce and jobs for the Braddock community, which is a true food desert, not in the overused sense that if you don't have enough restaurants. Again, Braddock has no restaurants. Next, please. This was our welcome sign when I took office. Can people see that in the back? It says, "Welcome to Historic Braddock, compliments," and somebody spray painted Crips underneath it. So as you were driving into Braddock, it was, your welcome sign was sponsored by the Crips. And to me, to let that stand is essentially saying that the town's thrown in the towel. Because if, thousands of people drive through my community every day, and if that's the message that we want to send, we decided that we need to send a new one, and that's exactly what we did. The young people worked with a distinguished Pittsburgh artist and created a gigantic Welcome to Braddock sign. Next slide, please. And then we added one at the far end, which we stole the idea from the Heinz ketchup bottle. So it's a neon sign where the steel fills the Braddock and it flashes at the other end of Braddock Avenue across from the mill. Next, please. This was an abandoned school in the community. Next slide. And now it's the only art gallery and performance space in the 4 area. And actually hosted a play that Vanessa was involved with that sold out. One of 2 plays that is now open in Braddock in the past couple weeks. Next. People that here live locally, no doubt, are familiar with UPMC. Who likes UPMC? Now everyone go all at once. I actually like UPMC, and I would have liked them even more if they would have kept the hospital in town, but they decided that poor people and healthcare is an equation that they no longer wanted to work. So they took our hospital and they tore it down, and that's what it looks like. That's a 275,000 square foot building, and our area's access to healthcare right there, and that's right in the middle of downtown Braddock. So what we took with that, moving forward, next please, is that partnering with the Allegheny Health Network and Highmark, fantastic organizations that believe charity begins in the community for medical care, and we have the nicest urgent care center in Western Pennsylvania, right in the community. Next, please. And on that same site, we have approximately 30 new housing units, which there was 300 applications for those openings. Outstanding and demonstrative of the desire for people to move back into our community. Next, please. Braddock was also selected by Levi Strauss to be their national campaign several years ago. And in that campaign, in exchange for a nice donation that fixed up our community center, every one of the young people in the ad campaign, which was ran nationally, was Braddock residents. And in most cases, young people that I worked with in various programs. Next slide, please. Another young father with his son. And again, 100% of the funds went to the community and went to the residents themselves that were featured in the campaign. Next slide, please. We have the first Carnegie Library. Another positive development since we've been mayor is that it's now a historic landmark. Next slide, please. We have unprecedented youth outreach. That's Chef Souza, who's opening the restaurant in the community, working with the young people, teaching them culinary skills. Next slide, please. We have a boxing gym in the old community center in the abandoned church. Again, thanks in part to Levi's. Next, please. We have the first microbrewery that opened in Braddock since 1937, which was owned by the Rooneys, actually. The Brew Gentlemen opened up a year ago, and they are now the highest reviewed brewery in the Pittsburgh area on Yelp and Beer Advocate, which is a remarkable accomplishment for any small business, let alone one that is opening, on downtown Braddock. Next, please. New housing, new lofts, our effort to continually attract artists in the community. Next slide, please. We actually just won an award a couple years ago. We have a small-scale apiary in our community from bees that were harvested from abandoned homes that were about to be torn down. Now, middle school students are able to learn beekeeping, and in 2013, it won the Governor's Award for Environmental Excellence. Next, please. And this is what happens, at a traffic stop that we had, last summer. This is the reality here that you can never forget when you're in Braddock is that we continually must make this a safer community. And this was taken off a 17-year-old. Next, please. We've also created the Free Store, which has eliminated clothing insecurity, diapers, formula. There's no reason that any young mother or any person in Braddock has to go without key items of clothing or formula or anything like that now in Braddock. Next, please. Another slide, please. Okay. And then a year and a half ago, Lego donated 30,000 pounds of Lego kits. 30, I'm not exaggerating, it was literally 30,000 pounds. They brought it in on a tractor trailer, and we handed out close to 8,000 kits, not only for young people in ours, but we had people coming as far away from West Virginia to get a couple Lego kits. Yeah. Next slide, please. In 2005, I won by one vote. And I voted for myself. That's the joke that I never get tired of using that joke in presentations. In my next election, I won by a 2-to-1 margin. And then in 2013, next slide, I won by almost 9-to-1 margin. Now that's not to say, John, you're awesome, you're that guy. No, it's not. It's to try to convey the best way I know how that this is democracy in action. It's like, I didn't move in and start to impose these changes. This is working with the community that's there and realizing that, if I don't do what the community wants, I'm out of a job. Next, please. And then how does this all impact on public safety in our community? Well, I pulled all the police calls from County 911, and we've had about a 50% drop in the amount of calls and calls for police service in our community. We, last summer, the last 2 summers, we went from June to the end of August without a single gun call, including shots fired. which if anyone that lives in a community not unlike Braddock, you realize that that's a pretty remarkable statistic. Next, please. And that allowed us to go over almost 5.5 years without a murder in our community. And if somebody asked me, John, what's the thing you're most proud of during your time in Braddock, whenever that ends, it's going to say that we didn't put anybody in the ground for those 5.5 years. Because when you've seen that firsthand, this arm is a list of all the homicides that have occurred in my town since I've been in Braddock, and that dates back to 2006. And I have to tell you, it is the absolute worst thing in the world to get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning and know what you have to go look at. Next, please. And that streak, unfortunately, was broken in September of 2013. And the tragic loss of life occurred on that. Senseless, absolutely senseless. Next slide, please. Another thing that we have going on, and it pertains to where we're at today, Out of the Furnace. It was a movie starring Christian Bale and Woody Harrelson, and it takes place in Braddock, and it was shot in Braddock. And it chronicles the lives of two brothers that grew up, one of which goes to prison for a crime. Next, please. And that's the director, Scott Cooper, who directed Jeff Bridges to his first Oscar in Crazy Heart. That's Zoe Saldana on the left, and that's Christian Bale on the right there in our community. Next. That's Christian Bale again. That tattoo on his neck is this one. They replicated, 15104, which is my other one, the zip code of the community. And of course, many of you have heard the restaurant that we're opening in Braddock as well, which is going to we're opening the first restaurant in Braddock to open a new restaurant in Braddock in close to 40 years. Next. That's a rendering of what it'll look like when it's finished, if it ever gets finished. Let me just tell you, as an aside, if someone ever says, let's open a restaurant, don't. If I had any hair, I wouldn't have any hair, after this one. Next. And another thing that we're most proud of is that because of a generous donation, we're able to start the Braddock Promise, which is identical to the Pittsburgh Promise, where we give young kids from our school a scholarship of $10,000 a year to attend college that mirrors the Pittsburgh Promise exactly. Next, please. And then we're also eliminating food insecurity, 412 Food Rescue. It won Google's Code Fest, and it is a food rescue and delivery service that is modeled after Uber, where Whole Foods will send us a message via smartphone app to a driver to pick up all this food and then drive it to the hill. We have location drop-offs in a bunch of different communities throughout the Braddock area, the Pittsburgh area. And then finally, this awful image. So this was taken almost a year ago, and this was a 16-year-old that died in our community. And I show this image to drive home the fact that in many ways, I have the best job in the world, but in many ways, it's also the most wrenching, because this is the thing that motivates me, is that we have to eliminate this. And what I would say to anybody that's in a situation like that, as Vanessa said, think before you do something. The tragedy here is that young man will never get a second chance. And I know my reality is that if I grew up in a community with as many challenges as the young people in Braddock have, I more than likely would be right in here, or I would be on the sidewalk too. This is not a judgment call by any stretch. It's saying that we in this country, I think, have moved too far and the gap is too wide. And that's one of the things that I try to do in Braddock in my own small way, is to try to close that gap and provide more opportunities. And thankfully, like tomorrow, for example, we have a 16-year-old that we're sending to Boston with his mother, the first time they've been out of Pittsburgh, to go on a tour of Harvard University. So I thank you for the time here.